A used SUV showed up on a buyer's driveway for $11,000, less than the newer version of the same nameplate, and the seller couldn't explain why. The truth is simple. The engine under the hood does not shut down half its cylinders at highway speed, and that single difference is worth more than most buyers realize. We're talking about the first-generation Honda Pilot, built from 2003 through 2008. This is the Pilot before Honda introduced variable cylinder management, the fuel-saving system that later caused rough idling, spark plug fouling, and expensive oil consumption complaints on newer Honda V6 engines. This early Pilot runs a simple, fixed-displacement 3.5-liter V6 that always fires on all 6 cylinders. No deactivation solenoids, no software trying to seamlessly switch between 3 and 6 cylinders while you're merging onto a freeway. Just a V6 doing what V6 engines have done reliably for decades. That single design choice is why this generation of Pilot deserves a second look, and why it's currently one of the most underpriced family SUVs on the used market. Honda introduced VCM to its V6 lineup, starting with the Odyssey minivan, and it eventually made its way into the Accord V6 and the redesigned second-generation Pilot that launched for 2009. That newer Pilot is a fine vehicle in many respects, but its VCM system has a well-documented reputation for 2 specific complaints. Owners report a shudder or vibration when the engine transitions between cylinder modes, especially once the engine has some mileage on it, and a subset of owners report accelerated oil consumption, believed to be linked to how the deactivated cylinders handle oil control under certain driving conditions. Neither issue affects every single example, but both issues are common enough that they show up constantly in Honda owner forums and independent mechanic discussions, and they are expensive enough to matter. A failed VCM component or a related engine repair can run well into 4 figures. The first-generation Pilot sidesteps that entire conversation because the technology simply isn't there. This generation uses Honda's J35 V6, a naturally aspirated single overhead cam engine, shared in a similar but not identical form across several Honda and Acura products of that era. It's not a fragile design. It doesn't burn oil at a notable rate when properly maintained. It doesn't have a turbocharger to fail, and its timing system uses a chain rather than a rubber belt, which means you're not budgeting for an expensive belt replacement every 90 to 100,000 miles the way you would with some competitors from that decade. The transmission is a conventional 5-speed automatic. It's not flashy. It's not a continuously variable transmission, and it doesn't try to simulate gear changes electronically. It shifts like a normal automatic because it is one. That matters to a buyer who has been burned by a CVT failure on a different brand, because a traditional stepped automatic gives a transmission shop something straightforward to diagnose and rebuild if it ever needs work, rather than a sealed unit that often gets replaced wholesale. Where this Pilot generation asks for patience is fuel economy and interior polish. City mileage in the high teens is normal, and this was before Honda tightened up cabin materials to the level buyers expect from a modern crossover. The dashboard plastics are utilitarian, not upscale. If your frame of reference is a current Honda interior, stepping into a 2004 Pilot will feel like a downgrade in refinement, even though the mechanical layout underneath is arguably simpler and more serviceable. There's also a real range across these model years that buyers should understand before shopping. Honda made a running update partway through this generation, refreshing the front and rear styling for the 2006 model year and carrying it through 2008. The mechanical layout stayed largely consistent, but a 2006 or newer example typically brings updated safety features, including additional airbags that weren't standard on the earliest 2003 models. If a young family is cross-shopping this generation specifically for its price advantage, that 2006 and later window is worth prioritizing, even if it costs a little more than an early 2003 example. All-wheel drive was optional across the lineup, and used Honda's variable torque management system, which normally operates in front-wheel drive and automatically sends power to the rear axle when it detects slip. It's a simple, largely mechanical system rather than a driver-selectable setup, and it holds up well with regular fluid service. That's a meaningful detail for buyers in snowbelt states who want confident winter traction without inheriting a complicated transfer case that requires specialized fluid and frequent attention. On price, this generation of Pilot has settled into genuinely affordable territory. High-mileage examples with 200,000 miles or more, particularly base trims without leather or a rear entertainment system, often show up in the $4,000 to $6,000 range from private sellers. Cleaner examples with more reasonable mileage, somewhere in the 100,000 to 150,000 mile range, tend to land in the $7,000 to $10,000 range, depending on region and trim. That's a meaningful gap compared to a comparable second-generation Pilot with VCM, which frequently commands several $1,000s more for a vehicle carrying a documented mechanical complication this earlier version simply doesn't have. If you're shopping this generation, there are a few things worth checking before you hand over cash. Rust is the biggest regional variable. In Salt Belt states, inspect the rear subframe, the rear wheel wells, and the exhaust hangers closely, since corrosion in structural areas is a legitimate reason to walk away, regardless of how good the engine sounds. Ask for maintenance records showing regular transmission fluid changes, because while this 5-speed automatic is fundamentally sound, neglecting fluid service on any automatic transmission shortens its life. And listen for a rear differential whine on AWD models during a test drive, since that's the most common wear item on the all-wheel drive system, and a worn unit is a real, if not catastrophic, repair cost. None of this makes the first-generation Pilot a perfect vehicle. It's not going to feel modern. Safety technology like stability control wasn't standard until partway through the run, and the overall crash test performance reflects mid-2000s engineering rather than what you'd find in a current SUV. If your household regularly drives long highway commutes and fuel costs matter to your monthly budget, the mileage penalty compared to a newer Pilot is real and worth factoring in. But for a buyer whose priority is a dependable 7-seat SUV they can afford in cash, one that won't hand them a VCM-related repair bill 3 years into ownership, this generation earns its price. It represents Honda's V6 engineering in its most straightforward form, built before the company added a fuel-saving feature that, for a meaningful number of owners, ended up creating more mechanical complexity than it saved in fuel costs. The lesson here extends past this one SUV. When a manufacturer adds a new piece of technology to save fuel or meet emissions targets, that technology doesn't arrive perfected. It arrives as a first attempt, and early versions of clever engineering solutions often carry real-world problems that don't show up until thousands of owners have logged hundreds of thousands of collective miles. The generation built right before that new technology often represents the most mature, most sorted version of the basic mechanical formula. It's not always the newest vehicle that represents the smartest purchase. Sometimes it's the last one built, before the manufacturer complicated a design that was already working fine. If you're the kind of buyer who wants dependable transportation without gambling your savings on a feature still being worked out, that's the version worth searching for. And it's usually sitting on a used lot for thousands less than the shiny, improved model parked right next to it. If this kind of research helps you shop smarter, the next video breaks down which specific Honda and Toyota V6 engines to avoid entirely, and why the badge on the hood matters far less than the exact configuration under it.